So, yeah, what are you working on for your PhD?
So we've done a little bit of work. We've gotten force plates from Hawken Dynamics, and we have been doing like a lot of jump testing with the high school athletes.
Yeah.
We actually ended up doing a presentation on a bunch of data we collected at Coaches College, which is
Hmm.
like a really well-known, renowned sports science and strength conditioning present few days of presentations at East Tennessee State with
Yeah.
Michael and Meg Stone, who are, Michael Stone is basically the like godfather of American sports science. He wrote the Principles and Practice of Resistance Training.
Hmm.
He, he's authored more publications than I probably can count. And he has like just a hugely prestigious background in sports science. And then his wife, Meg Stone, was a D1 head strength coach at a football. She was the first female D1 head strength coach for a football program.
Cool.
I think that was like, in the 90s or 80s. And
Yeah.
she's been a head strength coach kind of, here and there since. She was an Olympian as a thrower.
Ooh,
So
what
they're
event?
like, yeah, they're like insanely successful in what they do. And they ended up going to Tennessee, and East Tennessee State and starting the program that's basically produced, Mike Israetel graduated from that program. He has a PhD in sport physiology. Christian Carter, my mentor, Guy Hornsby, and then, handfuls and handfuls of people come from that program and end up becoming very competent
Hmm.
professionals like sports scientists. So that, for me, we won, in a roundabout way, we presented at that conference, which was really unique and really, really cool.
Yeah.
Uh, Also to kind of be a part of that lineage has been really interesting for me. And the actual information we presented on was mostly descriptive. I mean, almost entirely descriptive. It's like, how do high school athletes, what's their like neuromuscular like ability look like in a
Right.
counter movement jump that's unloaded and loaded. And the loaded condition is important because you're trying to, as your co-host Josh mentioned, uh, a lot of these kids who come into high school, they're not very strong and they're not
Hmm.
very explosive and they're not very fast. So, they might jump high. You might see a kid who can kind of jump pretty high and get a
Right.
nice like pop off the ground. And then you put a barbell on his back, you impose a little bit of load. Um, and suddenly that number might be stifled because it's like to move something beyond their own body mass can be a big, big challenge.
Yeah.
And athletics is really all about manipulating other people and manipulating implements
Right.
or utilizing the ground in some way to generate force.
Yeah.
So we looked at, unloaded jumps and loaded jumps and tried to look at like fall off. So if kids are jumping on average, say like, you know, 15 inches, how does that change when you put some sort of implement on? How does that change performance? So we did a bunch of that. We've been doing that over the last like year and a half. And then my dissertation as of now, the whole process of kind of like figuring that out and trying
Hmm.
to decide what makes sense, um, is actually going to be comparing two measures or two tests of isometric maximal strength. So if
Okay.
you look in the literature on performance and performance monitoring, like athlete monitoring,
Hmm.
you'll notice there's a ton of work with the isometric mid-thigh pull.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That's like the gold standard.
Uh-huh.
It's like how do you measure force production, and then how do you measure the rate at which that force is produced to know if your athlete's improving and becoming a potentially better, sport athlete, like player.
Right.
There, we could get into a bunch of different rabbit holes. I'll try to be concise, which I'm not. But the
We
reason
got
that's
time.
used is, the reason that's done is because you put the athlete in like an athletic stance, right? They're in the power position, knees bent, hips flexed, up and down, strapped to a bar, and then they produce force as maximally and as rapidly as they can. And then you get two values. You get peak force, and then you get rate of force development across different time bands. So within like, 0 to 50 milliseconds, 0 to 100, 100 to 150. And then you could say like, okay, how steep's the curve? and then how stretched out is the curve. We want
Hmm.
it to be steep. We want them to be really brutishly strong. And then we want that curve to be steep. We want it to be fast.
Right.
Because in a sprint or a lot of like change of direction movements and ground contacts, the amount of time you have to act on the ground, to act on someone else, to respond to some sort of like external cue, it's very short.
Hmm.
Right. So it's not really just like how strong are you, but it's like how quickly can you produce that force to use it. So isometric mid-thigh pull, there's a great paper. It's something along the lines of like isometric mid-thigh pull testing 25 years later, and it's kind of like a synopsis on why that would be a useful athlete monitoring tool and just like a tool to use and kind of more generally. So we're taking that, and then we're taking something that's kind of been a more recent like innovation on that, which would be an isometric belt squat. So it's saying like the
Okay.
mid thigh pull is complicated by the fact you have to strap up to a bar, get into a good power position, and then try to run athletes through that. And Josh, as you would know, in like a big team setting, if you're trying to run kids through some sort of like performance testing or monitoring
Yeah.
testing, like it would just have to be slow if you have 40 kids.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you're constrained by time. So it's like, what's a way to obviate that? It's like to simplify the task, to make it easier to learn and easier to do. So you would do so, there's some research looking at isometric belt squat, using that to similarly measure force production in like an athletic power position, and then measure that rate of force development. So basically, as of now, it's going to be comparing those two tests to say, hey, what are the differences in force? Like peak force values and then rate of force development. How do they compare? And then when you use those to calculate a DSI, which is looking at kind of like your explosive strength, um, and your ability to produce force in a counter movement jump versus your ability to produce force isometrically. And then you get a ratio which would tell you like, oh, you're kind of slow, or oh, you're really explosive, but you don't produce a ton of force.
Hmm.
Um, it would say like how would an isometric mid thigh pull and then an isometric belt squat like test fit into calculating the DSI, or the dynamic strength index.
Okay.
So tentatively, like in the 2 years I've been here, that's kind of where we've gotten to in terms of like figuring that out, and learning the skills along the way to be able to kind of incorporate it and get to work on it. But a PhD is a process beyond just like a singular study or
Yeah.
series of studies. You have exams and checkpoints and benchmarks and classes, and so like navigating the kind of like chaos of that has been the most complicated part of the journey. And then I feel like once coursework's done for your PhD, you switch into proposal mode, dissertation mode. I'm in my last semester of classes, so once I round this
Okay.
out, like um, besides the summertime, which I'm actually in the process of, well, I applied to intern with the UFC as a sports science
Oh,
intern.
cool.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. But like beside that, like the proposal and dissertation, that stuff is almost like the simple, straightforward stuff, which would be,
Right.
setting up the tests, running participants through it, getting the data, getting the results, and then analyzing it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that I like that idea of moving from the mid thigh pull to the belt squat. I know I'd read some mid thigh pull research a long time ago, and one of the big criticisms that I walked away from it was that it was untrained, and then they were doing interventions on untrained athletes,
mm,
right? And so on the initial pull, they had pretty lackluster results. They trained them for a few weeks, they did it again,
sure.
and as you mentioned, like coordinating all that effort, like it's a full body chain of motion when you're doing a mid thigh pull, right? And
Yeah,
so like
totally.
just having done it once before is probably going to have a pretty significant impact on what you do after you've had a couple good nights sleep or whatever. So I think that's pretty cool doing the belt squat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first thing I thought about was sometimes you get some of your best athletes that just come to you athletic, so they're not necessarily interested in working real hard. Like, well, I already can dunk. Why would I train?
Mm, sure.
Whereas this might show them like, look, yes, you are explosive, but you're not powerful.
Mm,
We might be
right.
able to, if we can get you powerful, like you're not going to dunk, you're going to be able to slap the top of the backboard,
Hmm.
and that's what something that is, I feel like in some rare occasions, but the better the athlete sometimes is, it's harder to get them to actually buy into the weight room.
Yeah, it's good because it's like, well, my abilities are like sufficient or beyond sufficient for like the current context I'm in.
Hmm.
It's like I'm the guy, right? It's like what else would I, I already can dominate. And it's like, well, but at the next level,
Right.
there's a stark change. Like
Yeah.
that difference is steep. That change is steep. Um, which is interesting too. I think like being in the high school context and having to work through some of the complications of that has been really interesting. Um, because it really isn't just like a matter of, want. It's not just like a matter of want. It's a matter of like if or can. And then it's also like as you mentioned, what's the nature of like the sport itself, the sport coach's involvement, um, and so many different like other inputs. Whereas you talk about coaching like weightlifters and powerlifters, that's like a luxury.
Yeah.
That's like the most relaxed thing possible
Yeah.
because one, they come to you and they're likely paying you
Hmm.
like individually, and then they're more mature, they're older, and then they like have all those character traits. So it's like they're much more dedicated, committed, interested, thoughtful, they're smart. They're not like 14-year-old boys who just don't have brains. Um,
They're
so
growing
like
them. They're growing them. They'll get there.
totally. They'll get there eventually. But they come to you and it's like, okay, hey, I want to be the best that I can be. Can you help me get there? And it's like, yeah, we totally can do that. And they're like, okay, it's going to take a long time, right? And it's like, yeah, it's going to take a really long time. And then, you know, 5 years later, you're on the podium on a national platform, and you're like, yeah, we kind of saw this through, and we kind of figured out like what we wanted to do. We figured out how to get there. When you get into like a high school setting, it's so much more complicated. So
And
so
you
much
you
more.
don't have that time
Right? Yeah,
for them
exactly.
No
Exactly.
5 year
yeah,
span.